Hi, I'm Ben Avery, and this is Strangers and Aliens from strangersandaliens.com. Strangers and Aliens is a podcast and a video series about science fiction and fantasy and faith and Christianity. And this video series that I'm doing, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do more after this, but I would like to. I'd love to take a look at some newer Christian science fiction and fantasy, and we'll see. We'll see what I can get my hands on. But this has been about the space trilogy from C.S. Lewis, and I've been asking the question, is it worth reading? Now, the answer to is it worth reading for the first two in the series has been a definite yes. Out of the Silent Planet, yes, because it sets up Paralandra, which is a huge yes. Now, they're both good books in their own right, but together, Out of the Silent Planet makes Paralandra better, and Paralandra makes Out of the Silent Planet better. Together, they taste great. It's a peanut butter chocolate combination. But for today's book, we're going to be looking at one that is longer than those two books put together. That Hideous Strength, which some you might say that hideous size. It is a big novel. It is a giant book. It is almost 400 pages here, and it is longer than these two books put together. But does that mean it's worth reading or not? Well, as we ask the question, is it worth reading, I want to do some explanation about the context of the answer, because almost anything that you read, you could say is worth reading for various reasons. You could say something is worth reading because it's so bad. In fact, there's a comic book, a Ghost Rider comic book that I bought because it had a guest star in it who's one of my favorite characters. And as I was reading that Ghost Rider comic book, I was thinking to myself, this is terrible. This is awful. I read it because just on the cover it said guest star, and that's why I bought it. And when I read it, it was terrible. It was awful. And it was something that I actually would hold up as an example of how to not write a comic book. Is it worth reading? Yes, because it's bad. Okay, but when I'm talking about is it worth reading in the context of this video series, I'm asking the question, is it worth reading? Yes or no. There's kind of a binary answer there. But in the yes, there is some context that goes along with it. I'm asking, is it worth reading as a Christian novel? Is it worth reading as a science fiction novel? Is it worth reading as just homework? When I say it's homework, it means it's something that you probably should be aware of and really should experience at least once, so that when you are looking at other things, you have context. I would say, honestly, Lord of the Rings is something that would be worth reading as homework because it gives context to fantasy that came after Lord of the Rings. If you are a fan of Game of Thrones or something like that, and you haven't read Lord of the Rings, you should read Lord of the Rings. You may not like it, but you should read it to see kind of what George R.R. Martin was riffing on and in some ways making a commentary on. He didn't like some of the themes and ideas and the ways that J.R.R. Tolkien told his story, and so George Martin did it his way. So anyway, That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. Is it worth reading? And to start with, my short, quick first answer is yes, kinda. I shouldn't say it like that, because it really is a good book. It is a good book, and it is a good book by C.S. Lewis, which means it's a great book in some ways. But I will also say this. This was a hard book for me to get into. I don't think I ever actually finished this book until I was in college. I think I said in my Paralandra episode that I was given the trilogy by my Aunt Maxine and Uncle Gary, and they gave it to me for my birthday or Christmas. I'm pretty sure it was my birthday, but it might have been Christmas, because I remember sitting down and reading Out of the Silent Planet and then reading Paralandra later on. But I don't remember when I actually read Paralandra, but I do remember in high school, so I must have read Paralandra in high school, because I remember in high school sitting down to read this, and I just could not get into it. In fact, this is the copy I had that I just could not get into. Now, you can see it's worn. It's been read a couple times since then, but I couldn't get into it. I just couldn't get into it. And I have to be in the right mood to get into this. And it was not something that excited me. In fact, C.S. Lewis was worried about that. He was worried that people wouldn't like it. And I did some reading recently because we're getting ready to do a podcast episode, an audio episode with me and one of my co-hosts about Out of the Silent Planet. So I've been doing some research, and I've been rereading the book. And I don't know if the episode will be out by the time this episode of the YouTube video series. I don't know if it'll be out before this or after, but if you go to strangersandaliens.com, you can look for it there. C.S. Lewis was worried that people weren't going to like this, that he was worried that people weren't going to know what to think of it. In fact, he writes an introduction and says, I have called this a fairy tale in the hopes that no one who dislikes fantasy may be misled by the first 2 chapters into reading further and then complain of his disappointment. If you ask why, intending to write about magicians, devils, pantomime animals, and planetary angels, I nevertheless begin with such humdrum scenes and persons, I reply that I'm following the traditional fairy tale. And so he's trying to say, hey, when you start reading that chapter where it's just a newlywed lady sitting in her house and just thinking about life, it's not the whole book, okay? And it's not, but I was that guy. I was the one that he was writing his preface for, and it still didn't get me further into the book when I was in high school. This was published in 1945, and so this is, again, something he was writing against the context of World War II happening, and he definitely, you can feel like there is just this oppression of the world in this book, and there's just a lot to this, and that's part of the problem that makes it hard to talk about, is because there is a lot going on in this book. There is social commentary. There's obviously the war was happening when he was writing it, but the intention is that this takes place afterward. But he has social commentary about that. He has social commentary going on about just the state of education and the state of higher education in England. In fact, he also mentions in his preface that there are ideas. Let's see, he says, this is a tall story about devilry, though it has behind it a serious point, which I have tried to make in my Abolition of Man. And so he is writing this as a novel, where this novel and this nonfiction book where he's making, this is an essay about the status of education and that sort of thing. And it's a great little book, by the way. There's so much stuff packed into this book. Is it worth reading? Yes. Okay. And honestly, there's some really interesting things that as you're reading this book that in the context of me as a modern 2020s American, there's a lot going on in this book when you read it you might see reflected in our current day. But anyway, this novel is meant to explore those ideas. And so that's good, but there's also stuff going on that has to do with Merlin. There's stuff that's going on that has to do with other planets. You have the first 2 books in the series, each take place on a different planet. Ransom visits other worlds in those books. In this one, it's all Earth. It's Earthbound. And in some ways, you might say, well, does that mean that his space trilogy really isn't a space trilogy? It really isn't, because he doesn't go anywhere in space. And yeah, whatever. The point is, I think that it's very interesting to me that these 3 books take place on these 3 planets so close in the solar system, so close in size, and they all are in different stages of development and in different stages of the life cycle of a planet. You have in Out of the Silent Planet, a planet at the end of its life cycle. In Paralandra, a planet in the middle of its life cycle. And then you have the fallen world, Earth, Paralandra was at the beginning of its life cycle. Earth is in the middle of its life cycle, and it's a fallen world that is on the precipice. There's just a lot going on that could have long-reaching consequences for the whole world. There's just a lot going on in here, and that's part of why it's so big. And there's also political intrigue within the confines of universities and organizations and scientific organizations, and so there are chapters devoted to a debate that's happening at a school deciding whether or not it wants to sell property or not. And so it could be a little hard to get into, but then there is some action that's happening. There's ideas that's going on in the book. Ideas of, again, I don't want to spoil. I want this to be kind of an introduction potentially for people who have not read the book. But there are these ideas that he explores, and these ideas that he explores end up being kind of a social, political thing that kind of funnels through this sci-fi ideas and fantasy ideas. And so that means, is it a good science fiction book? Yes, it's worth reading as a science fiction book. It's also worth reading as a Christian who likes to read novels. This is worth reading in that context? Is it worth reading as homework? Yes, it is. And I would say in some ways it's worth reading just as homework, because if you liked Paralandra, you get to see kind of where Ransom ends up. This wraps up Ransom's character arc. Now, there's a lot of other characters in this book. The character count in Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra, the character counts are really small, and this has a lot more characters in it. But again, that adds to the length. In some ways, you could look at this as, I mentioned earlier that Out of the Silent Planet feels like, the first season of a TV show. It may not be the greatest, but you want to watch it because it sets up great stuff to come. And then here you have, seasons 3 through 5 of Star Trek: The Next Generation, or seasons 2 through 4 of Babylon 5, where it's just like hitting on all cylinders and it's great. And then here you have, the final 2 seasons of a show that maybe they shouldn't have been made, but they're still good. You still want to watch them, and they do still explore great ideas, and honestly, maybe the Star Trek analogy works better here, because in season 7 of Star Trek, you have the series finale, and it's one of the greatest series finales of all time. And this, in some ways, is like that, because it does give us that wrap up to Ransom's character arc and what he's got going on, what he's doing. And yeah, so that Hideous Strength, it's long, it can be difficult to get into, but I would say that depending on the kind of thing that you like, you might find this intriguing and you might find it boring. I mean, if you want to see more action and if you want to see more Star Wars than Star Trek, then this might be a little bit boring for you. And honestly, it still might be boring for you if you want to see more Star Trek kind of stuff going on. So, yes, is it worth reading? Yes, conditionally. So, I enjoy it. I don't read it over and over and over again the way I have with Paralandra, the way I have with Till We Have Faces, and a couple other books that are just, I call them decade books, where I have to make sure I read it at least once every decade of my life. And when you read it, you will engage with it in a different way. And so, Paralandra, I think, is definitely decade book worthy. And in my life, it was definitely decade book worthy. I read Paralandra in my teens at least once, possibly twice, maybe more. I don't know. I just know that I loved it when I read it in my teens. When I read it in my 20s, I read it a few times in my 20s, once for fun, once in college, and then a couple times after college. And in my 30s, the same kind of thing, at least twice in my 30s, and then a few times here in my 40s. We'll see what happens in my 50s. I haven't made it there yet, so we'll see what happens. Till We Have Faces. Till We Have Faces is one that I read a few different times as well. I have 2 copies of it because I loaned one copy to a friend and needed to read it for the podcast. But this is the copy that I read when I was in high school. And when I read it in high school, it was okay. It was fine. It was good. It was C.S. Lewis, so I liked it, and it is a great novel. And so when I read it in high school, I at least recognized that there was something good about it. It was a good book. Okay, it was C.S. Lewis. I was reading it because it was C.S. Lewis homework, because he wrote it. It was kind of a fantasy thing, and so I was going to read it and enjoy it, and I did. But then when I read this book in my 20s, I decided this is amazing, and I have a feeling that this is the best book I've ever read. And, in my 20s, I had read a lot of books, but I decided this is the best book I've ever read. And so I read it a couple times in my 20s. In my 30s, I went back to it, and it still was my favorite book, and came back to it for the audio podcast. And that's when I had to buy this copy of it, because I loaned the other copy out. But this is the copy that I read for the podcast. And then I read this copy a year ago, and fell in love with this book again. And it brought me to tears the last time I read this book. It was just so beautiful. And it hit me different at every stage of my life. And I think it might have hit me different and caused me to be moved to tears because of just the things that were happening in her life and the things that were happening in my life. And so a decade book is, in some ways, an anchor book where you can it's a barometer. You can gauge. The book is here, and the book hasn't changed, but I have, as I'm reading it. And I wouldn't say that Hideous Strength is a decade book worthy title, but That Hideous Strength and Out of the Silent Planet have kind of become decade books for me, I guess, because of Paralandra. Because every once in a while when I'm reading Paralandra, I want to take a look at the satellites around it, and see that first story, which this one, it's a breezy read, and so it was easy to do, but this, not so much. And so when I'm sitting down to read this or listen to this, it's a time commitment. It is definitely a time commitment. And so that's why when I answer the question, is it worth reading? My answer is yes. And I'm not being fair to the book. This is a really good book. And I'm kind of, in some ways, I'm almost teasing the book a little bit. But is it worth reading? Yes. Yes, it is. And will there be more Is It Worth Reading videos? I don't know. We will see. I have a couple ideas for some upcoming books to talk about, books that I've read in the past, but I'd also love to get my hands on some new Christian sci-fi books. And there's actually a Christian sci-fi book that I did get my hands on not too long ago that was a very serendipitous surprise, and maybe I'll talk about that one. And there's also another book that is related to this sci-fi series with Ransom that I might do as well. So until next time, visit strangersandaliens.com. That's where you can find our audio podcast. And you can also go to any podcatcher that you listen to. And we have hundreds of episodes about hundreds of topics. And so there's bound to be something that you might find interesting. And like I said before, we will be talking about, if we have not already released the episode, we will be talking about in more depth that Hideous Strength as well. So again, thank you so much for spending time with me. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, Godspeed.